And I will be referring to my phone every once in a while for a couple of notes here that I've got, because that's my only option. Okay. A little bit there. Okay. Great. All right. You ready? All right, welcome to Cwic Show. My name is Greg Mattson, and I am your host. In this episode, we bring back Noel B. Reynolds to talk about scribalism and the ancient scribal schools. Noel, welcome back to the show.
Thank you. Good
Very
to be
excited
here.
about this. You know, we put this out. Our last interview was about 4 months ago, and it's very interesting because in the meantime, in my little circle and then outside of my circle, I've started to hear people talking about the scribal school, especially when it's related to the brass plates. And I'm thinking, okay, they've seen this, they've gone over this, and because as we've talked about this, no one's really studying this. And so I just thought that was interesting. So you're getting out there, Noel. This is getting out there one way or another. So,
well, I hope so. It's really been an exciting new phase of my own research. I see it as giving us a new and important window for reading the Book of Mormon, for any of the scriptures. And it connects up with so many things that are in our Pearl of Great Price and the Book of Mormon that we haven't previously recognized. We haven't seen the connection, haven't seen the significance of this. And part of that is because it's really only in the last few decades that these scholarly world that studies these things has brought together the big picture.
yeah, well, it does. You go into some of the scriptures, we can go, we'll do this, but, going into even First Nephi 1, at the very beginning of the Book of Mormon, it's launched by almost a scribal statement by Nephi. And then it makes you start thinking about, well, how was he brought up? What is the background of this guy? What is the background of Mormon? What is the background of these prophets that are actually writing? And you realize in a world of illiteracy that the level of education had to start very early on and was very comprehensive. I mean, these are like they're going to Harvard, from the time they're 5 years old to pick up this information and get this education.
It's hard for us to get the full picture, to easily grasp the difference between literate and oral societies. And everything before Gutenberg was an oral society. But writing was used by those societies for all kinds of things from the 3rd century BC. And what this required is that there be a small group of people who are teaching writing to a new generation constantly and providing people who can write materials for the application of law, for business, for medicine, for magic, for scriptures, for literature, for government administration. All of these are developed areas of human activity that used writing, but they had to have highly trained people doing the writing. And sometimes the writers were the main participants, the authoritative participants, but other times they were just hired writers. And so the scholars who have studied this throw out different percentages. The largest percentage I've ever seen anybody suggest is that 5% of the population might have been able to read at some level. But certainly reading at a high level, like the scriptures that we have, that was less than 1% of the population, for sure, that could read and write at that level.
So that would have been, let's think of the ramifications of this to start off with. So number one, we should understand that the Israelite dad in the family does not have an iPhone or a quad that he has in his home, in his tent, or wherever he is, where he's teaching the gospel to his family, right? What does he have? Well, he probably can't read. It's highly likely he can't read. What does he have? He's got oral tradition. I think a lot of these oral traditions that come in are primarily, as I see it, from the Israelites. It comes from the festivals. Right? They go through the festivals, they pick up their doctrine, they understand the gospel there, they see it played out, and then you have chants and poems and everything where these things are easily repeatable, right? And you could repeat those things when you went home. You could repeat them and have your family repeat them, but that's how you learn. That's what they did.
And the scholars who have looked at this recognize that many things that were important for the general public to know were written in a form that made them easily remembered. And Latter-day Saints are familiar with chiasmus from the Book of Mormon. Chiasmus, one of its main features is that it facilitates memory. And so passages that are written chiastically are more easily memorized and repeated and repeated and repeated and repeated, and so they could be repeated in homes and in smaller assemblies, but to get the chapters of Isaiah, there's only one way to get that, and that's to sit down and roll out that scroll and read it.
Yeah. Now I want to recap a few things that we talked about in the last interview, because I want a foundation and a basis for people that didn't see that before we move on to some of the additional things that you studied.
Sure.
and want to bring up. But so first of all, let's look at the scribal schools. You've got young men that are put into these schools around the age of 5 years old, and what this does when you think about it, well, first of all, it's not just writing that they're going through. Right, they are all in these schools that may have schooling about military issues. They've got engineering and arithmetic. They've got land measurement, especially somewhere like Egypt, where you've got the Nile and you've got land disputes as the waters come up and then they subside. And you've got all these different ways that society needs to run, and so you need people that are educated in this way. And they're almost, it seems like they're almost being trained as like Renaissance men in the king's court.
I would only amend that in the following way. In the early years, the focus was on reading and writing, and that could be 3-4 years, maybe a little longer. But those who did well with that had the option of specializing in these different areas that you've mentioned, and so not everybody would study everything through their entire student career. They would break off, specialize, prepare for certain specific kinds of jobs. At least the records in Egypt, where you are right now, especially makes that clear. That there's many different emphases, and the different schools had different specialties, preparing people for different walks of life.
Yeah. Now, of course, when I go back and I look at it, I think about someone though like, well, let's start with Nephi, right? Nephi, who's obviously a scholar and obviously a scribe. I mean, you go back and you look at his first few verses of First Nephi 1, and you see this very differently when you understand that he had to be in a scribal school. This is not just some teachings that his dad pulled him aside at times and talked to him about. This is a very highly educated person, and yet he can hunt. He has metallurgy skills. I'm guessing he's got some type of carpentry skills, even though the Lord is giving him the instructions on this. I mean, he seems to have some carpentry skills as well. So there is some breadth, it seems to me, in these things. Mormon, another one, which is really one you pointed out to me before. Here's a young boy that's 10 years old. he's already been identified as a sober kid and the one that needs to learn more. Like you were just kind of saying, maybe the first few years he's going just through learning to write, but then he becomes a military man, and so maybe that's just his focus. But I don't know. It seems to me that they've got some type of a breadth of knowledge, of education in different skills and fields.
We have so many areas of specialty in modern society. We probably overestimate how much breadth that would be required in earlier civilizations, where everybody was probably exposed to most of the developed professions, expertise. So people knew carpenters, people knew magicians, they knew lawyers. I think there'd be a lot more of that in those societies. And the other thing that should be remembered is that because there are so few scribes, they had material needs: paper, ink, metal plates, all these kinds of things. They had to provide those for themselves. There wasn't a big market out there providing this stuff. And so the scribal schools would have a workshop, and the scribes themselves would be trained to create these materials. And some of these scholars have speculated that metalworking was a particular field that was often aligned with scribal families. So
yeah, and it's so, of course, we're learning more and more. That used to be one of the big pushes against the Book of Mormon and the gold plates about writing on metal, and then we find a few things in metal, and now there's more and more being unearthed in so many Middle East societies about with metal plates being used and written on, and so that's a not only a home run for Joseph Smith, but it would require, as you say, a metallurgical skill to be able to add this that Nephi seems to have. And going back even further, when you go back and look at the swords that are made, that's Nephi starting off. He goes off and they start making swords early on, and he recognizes a very curious workmanship, which is high skill level of Laban's sword. He knows what he's looking at. He knows what he's talking about.
Yeah, it's and remember that Nephi repeatedly emphasizes that he makes the plates and the record with his own hands.
And then you've gone on and you've showed also how that goes from his hands to Jacob's, and it goes down to, there is a perfect, call it a scribal DNA that goes from Nephi all the way to Moroni, which was very important for them to show.
And as long as you brought that up, we have actually two versions of that in the Book of Mormon. In Nephi's small plates, that skill peters out after several generations, and the last contributor to the small plates, Malachi, doesn't even claim to be able to write. He speaks to whoever is doing the writing for him, and then hands the record. He gives up on the record, and he gives it to the king. Why the king? Because the king, Mosiah, has inherited the large plates, the royal responsibility of keeping the main Nephite record on those large plates. The king has a continuing, developed scribal school, and then all of the later part of the Book of Mormon comes out of that. So they really have two different trajectories. The first one peters out. The other one is maintained all the way down to Ammoron, Mormon, Moroni.
Now, of course, you see immediately in the beginning of Mosiah, King Mosiah's got the plates, and then one of the first things he talks about is teaching the language to his sons. Right? He emphasizes that right at the beginning.
Yeah, and what languages?
Being Egyptian.
By the time of Mosiah, when he's teaching his sons about this, it seems to me the Nephites are dealing with at least 3 languages. They can read and write in Hebrew. They can, and I assume that Isaiah was always in Hebrew and probably some other things. And that would have been their initial their initial spoken language would have been Hebrew for the Nephites. But they have these brass plates, and the brass plates are written in Egyptian. And Nephi seems to start off in the beginning with the idea that Egyptian is the appropriate language for writing scripture. And he chooses to write the small plates in Egyptian. And so Mosiah's sons, and all the way down to Mormon Moroni, these scribes who are teaching the people out of the brass plates need to know Hebrew, Egyptian, and Nephite. Any linguist will tell you that by the time of Mormon and Moroni, as Mormon says, no one else knows our language.
Yeah.
They have their own language has evolved out of Egyptian, out of Hebrew, and what other language groups they have become exposed to over a 1,000-year period, which we know includes the Mulekites that were not easily understood when they came
and maybe
in.
even a little bit of Jaredite.
Yeah, exactly. So they've got to deal with multiple languages. Well, you don't do that if your entire life is in subsistence farming.
Yeah, exactly. It's now I want to back up a little bit again, and we talked about this last time, but I think that this is an important issue to understand. It's one of the most important things I think to understand in understanding that there were scribal schools, and that is the compiling of the brass plates and the necessity to have the brass plates. The brass plates, we know, go down through a Josephite line, and in my estimation, I would guess that you've got the book of Joseph in there, his writings. He wrote in there. He may have been the initiator of the plates, or maybe Abraham. And Abraham would have his writings, in there. And sometimes it seems like maybe he does. Maybe they're pulling from this a little bit. And so you've got this line coming down through Joseph. And what I try to explain to people, because the kind of the bumper sticker idea of the brass plates is that it's just the Old Testament uncorrupted, but it's not. It's a completely different line. It is a completely different book that has many of the similar books in it, but it's followed through by a different scribal tradition. It is, and that means a lot. I mean, what is kept in there? What was left out of the Old Testament can be very different from this other line, the scribal school line of Josephites that were apparently focused on Jesus Christ and the gospel of Jesus Christ. That is not followed in a later scribal tradition that we have in the Old Testament. And so it's really 2 separate books. It's not just a corrupted and an uncorrupted version. You've got 2 different books that come to us. Is that right?
Yeah, that's the way I see it. In fact, we can go a little further with that, I think. Once we understand the history of the Hebrew language and Hebrew writing, the scholarly world does not have any evidence that Hebrew was spoken as a separate language, or that there was Hebrew writing before about 900 AD, BC. And Egyptian, of course, goes back into the 2000s BC. So the if it's the case that the Manassite scribal school, the Josephites, that they do have written records going all the way back to Joseph. And that would include Moses, right? And Moses was trained in Egyptian too. That he was an educated Egyptian. That's the people have wondered, how do the Israelites start producing written records of a literary tradition they claim goes back 1,000 years when they don't have writing in Hebrew? Well, the easiest answer, for people who believe in the brass plates, the easiest answer is that that the Old Testament materials, much of that Old Testament material, especially the books of Moses, could have leaked over from the Ephraimites, the Manassites, the Josephites, who had a written record that went back all the way to Joseph. And they're the ones the Judahites are getting this from. That would make the Old Testament a much more reliable tradition than scholars have been able to portray it. Because the standard assumption in the Bible studies world today is that in the 600s, maybe starting in the 700s BC, that the Judahite scribes in Jerusalem sat down and started to transcribe using their new written language, starting to sat down and transcribe the oral traditions that would go back all the way to Moses and before. And it's hard for them to believe that oral traditions going back 1,000 years are giving us an accurate picture of Abraham and his family and his predecessors.
Yeah, and that brings up the additional question, though, was okay. So if we're talking about the Judahite line, which is undeveloped and reliant on the Josephite line, right, and that develops later. I think before you said you thought this developed sometime in the 7th century,
Yes.
BC. Okay, so this scribal it develops later on. The question is, has there already been an apostasy on the belief of a savior of the world taking on the sins of the world and the gospel of Jesus Christ when that develops? This is just fun conjecture here, but you've got the book that is found in the temple, maybe come close to the time you're talking about. That is a new book under Josiah, King Josiah, that is found, and all of a sudden all these things have to change. And there's mass reforms. That's just interesting to me. You talk about that developing at that time, and then all of a sudden, here's a new book that comes up and shows up.
Yeah, I haven't. Again, Bible scholars tend to equate Josiah's new book with Deuteronomy.
Yeah,
and there are several things that do suggest that connection, but certainly, even the Judahite understanding of the law of Moses in Lehi's day did not feature Jesus Christ at all.
Yeah, and I also wonder if that was in a reformed book of Deuteronomy, but a Judahite edition of Deuteronomy. Okay, what was that?
Just in passing, note that Margaret Barker has argued that that what we all have been taught is this wonderful reform by Josiah was actually a significant step away from Abrahamic religion, advancing a new version that could fit the culture of the times.
Yeah, and I've read all her stuff, and I think she's right on many things. There's a few things I'm like, I'm not sure about that, but as far as the reform at that point, I think that is right. The Deuteronomists take over, and they're named after that book. The issue, though, with saying that it is just purely Deuteronomy as it is, now we don't get the name Deuteronomy in the Book of Mormon, but we do get the five books of Moses,
Yeah,
saying that there are five books of Moses. So if they're pulling that, then they've got a Josephite record already of Deuteronomy.
yeah,
If that's the fifth book. Now
yeah.
maybe there's
That's
another
right.
book and we don't know about. That's possible, I suppose. But otherwise, we've got the five books of Moses are included in the brass plates. And then you have things like Jesus quoting Deuteronomy several times later on. And
Did
so
I can't remember our last conversation whether you stop me if I've talked about this before, but since the mid '90s, I've been arguing that the Book of Moses that we have in our Pearl of Great Price that was given to Joseph Smith just months after the publication of the Book of Mormon, that it is full of evidence that the Nephites were using that version of Genesis. The Book of Moses version of Genesis is what's in the brass plates and is what's used by the Nephites. And we have Jeff Lindsay has picked up what I started there in the 90s on that topic and has done a wonderful job in identifying 100 phrases and evidences that I didn't notice back then. And it's all now been published together in interpreter articles.
yeah, that's fascinating. That's yeah. Again, you're talking about a different book than the Old Testament.
That's right. No, that's exactly right.
Yeah, for the brass plates.
Yeah.
Now, moving on a little bit here. What are some of the things I know that you're getting ready to publish another paper? You've followed up with this very fascinating field and going into the scribal schools. What else have you discovered in the last 4 months that you think is something you want to share with us?
Well, I do have two more papers now that will be published sometime this year that extend it. The first one will be in a book that Carrie Hull and Ryan Sharp are putting together for the Religious Studies Center. And that's one where I show that you can document every transition of responsibility for the scripture records in among the Nephites, just all the way to the end of the book. We don't have any of this in the Old Testament. Who's responsible for keeping the records in the Judite tradition? Just zero. And it's a real frustration for the scholarly world that they don't have any of that. But in the Book of Mormon, we actually have Mormon is very conscious of this. He's a scribe. He's from the scribal school. And he documents, as he goes through the large plates of Nephi, he's documenting every transition in chief scribes all the way down to the end.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
So that's one thing. And I guess I probably mentioned that a little bit last time, but but we can actually, in this new paper, I actually show that those transitions and indicate how long any particular individuals were chief scribe. And we can, and most of that information is right there in the text. The second paper, the one I'm working on mostly right now, is one that works the other direction. I think we have in these first papers, I've showed how the Book of Mormon has a scribal tradition, but then turning it around, how about Abraham? Back to the beginning. And again, in the Book of Abraham, And in the book of Moses, we have much clearer statements of the writing education of Adam and his descendants. A book of remembrance was kept. They were taught in the language of Adam. They were taught to read and write. Go back to Book of Moses, chapter 6. God commanded Moses to write the vision in a book. That's in chapter 1 of the Book of Moses. And then you can carry that down. It requires speculation. So I'm offering the most what seem to be about the most reasonable speculations on that. And one of the main stories for Abraham, right there in the first chapter of Abraham, is getting the records. And having the records of his ancestors is important for documenting the priesthood. And as I look at it, I come to a conclusion that has been suggested by others. It's not original with me, but it seems to me needs to be taken more seriously and looked at in more detail. And that is that this repeated encounter between Abraham and Melchizedek has a lot more going on than just Abraham paying tithes. That Melchizedek is the connection because Abraham's own immediate ancestors are apostates. They're worshiping idols.
Mm-hmm.
But he meets up with Melchizedek, and Melchizedek seems to have be coming from the and we have side comments in the scriptures, Joseph Smith Revelations and other places, that Melchizedek preserves an original Adamic authority and scriptural tradition. And so,
what language was he writing in?
And that would be a nice thing to know. Now, it's interesting that Melchizedek and Abraham are spending most of their lives, at least, in the area that we would call Palestine today.
Mm-hmm.
And that entire area, a very large area there, includes several smaller countries today, was speaking what scholars used to call Phoenician. Now they call it West Semitic. And Hebrew is Hebrew, Edomite, Ammonite, other languages broke away from West Semitic, probably in the 10th century BC.
And so well after Abraham.
And they are mutually intelligible languages. And the writing system in which they're written really may have been invented in Egypt 1,000 years before that, but is not adopted by any scribal schools for writing serious texts until the time of in Jerusalem, when the Hebrews start writing down their oral traditions. That's when it first becomes used in major texts. So its invention has been shown to go back to Abraham's time in Egypt. The alphabet. Yeah, well, I mean, it's the invention of the alphabet.
Yeah, you've got. I mean, I know that you can go back to even as far back as the 3rd or 4th dynasty of the Egyptians, and they're already mentioning scribes at that point, which means that they were already somebody who was tutoring them and developed them, and so it's been around a very, very long time and going through these schools. But what about Abraham himself then? Okay, so he is going to go into Egypt from the book of Abraham, and he has a vision. He's looking through the Urim and Thummim, and he's got Abraham 3 and the creation story and et cetera, that is given to him. but what is told him is that he is going to be given this information so that he can teach the Egyptians.
Yes.
Right. That's what he's receiving this so that he can go in and teach the Egyptians, who are probably the world's leading astronomers. And so, does Abraham already know Egyptian?
Yes.
Yeah, it seems like he would have to already know Egyptian. He's going to go in there and flourish also like his great grandson Joseph. He must already know Egyptian.
The hypothesis I've put together on this, and it cannot be proven given any contemporary knowledge of ancient records, but I think it's reasonable given what can be proven. That is that Abraham was born in Ur. We now can see that Ur is northwest Syria.
Yeah, the northern one.
Right there where all this trouble with the Kurds is taking place, and the border with Turkey, up in that area. Well, that was Egyptian administered territory, conquered and administered during Abraham's time. And the evidence would seem to be that Abraham's family is part of that administration. They're familiar, certainly with the Egyptian priest is certainly aware of them, and some of the traditions about Abraham, none of which can be taken as proof. But the traditions of Abraham are that basically he was running around the palace as a child and learning and in the schooling there.
Yeah.
So Abraham comes, he's learning not only the vernacular of his family, which probably was an early form of Aramaic. It was the assumption that, which is very closely related to West Semitic.
Mm-hmm.
And Aramaic.
But the Babylonians eventually bring over to Babylon.
Yeah, and Aramaic picked up the West Semitic alphabet, and they have their own alphabet derived from the same alphabet that the Hebrew comes from. Mm-hmm. So the hypothesis would be that that's how Abraham grew up, that he did know Egyptian and Aramaic, but he lives most of his life, as does apparently Melchizedek, in an area that is speaking West Semitic, which would be closely related to Aramaic. Then we need to remember that as Abraham goes to Egypt, where he goes is the Nile Delta, and up there in northern Egypt, northeast Egypt even, and that area is regularly encroached upon by West Semitic speakers. Hyksos
and others, and yeah.
The famine that Abraham was fleeing was not the first famine. This is cyclical. And so these people in the West Semitic area, Palestine, regularly go down there, and scholars are starting to suspect that some of the pharaohs were actually from this West Semitic group. And so that Abraham knew the two languages that were used in that area. He could teach them. And of course, the idea of Abraham teaching, and later Joseph teaching the leading people in Egypt, those are traditions that have come down in different kinds of legends, most of them Jewish.
Yeah. There is so much intermingling with Egypt that I think people don't realize. And this is one of the things I try to do. Here I am in Cairo right now, and I'm one of the things I talk to those that come on these tours is, look, this is not, you have this idea of Egypt, and it's almost a Protestant idea that Egypt's bad and Israel's good, and that's all we know because of the Exodus story. And it's like there's so much more to this. I mean, Abraham goes to Egypt, Joseph is in Egypt, they're teaching in Egypt, Moses is from Egypt. It's all of, if you look at a restored 2 books from the Pearl of Great Price, they're Egyptian.
That's right.
The book of Moses and the book of Abraham and Jeremiah, Uriah, Jesus, his family goes to Egypt in exile. It's there's so much more there. And then, of course, if we're looking at the Scribal school and the foundational language for those Scribal schools is Egyptian, we should look at this like, wait a minute, the Book of Mormon comes through that line. The Book of Mormon, the brass plates through that Josephite line is in Egyptian. And there's so many stronger ties to Egypt than people actually realize. And of course, we'll walk people around the temples and show them a number of things here as well. There's also the ties there, but our heritage is, in many ways, and I think you brought this up last time. In fact, even DNA, maybe our heritage is Egyptian.
So you're in Cairo.
I'm in Cairo.
How far is it to Jerusalem?
I don't know the miles on that,
About
but
200.
not that far.
It's about 200.
200. Okay, that's pretty close.
Yeah. Even on horseback, that's
very manageable.
It's a week away.
Yeah.
So I've made a lot of difference and emphasized this difference between the Manassite scribal school that would have been thriving in the Northern Kingdom, and of course our Old Testament doesn't give us Northern Kingdom records the way it does the Southern Kingdom. But Jerusalem and Samaria are about 45 miles away from each other. It's just, these are not big distances, and these people intermingled. And when the Assyrians were threatening to take over the Northern Kingdom, the elites, some of the elites, and apparently Lehi's ancestors among them, fled to Jerusalem. The archaeologists that have been digging up ancient Jerusalem claim that the population of Jerusalem increased 15 times.
Wow.
At the time these elites were moving south.
Yeah. You think about the different size. You have Judah and Benjamin in Judah, and you've got the other 10 tribes up north.
Right.
I mean, there's a big difference in population, but it also, the Scribal school also, when you think about it, you go back to the rivalry that had to have existed. And I wonder how much of this is theological because of the Scribal schools that would have existed between the Northern Kingdom and the Southern Kingdom, even before they split. If one side is keeping only an oral tradition and the festivals, and one side has the actual written documentation from Abraham and Joseph and Moses, you're going to have, they're going to be saying, wait a minute here, what are you doing here? I'm checking you on this. This is what's in the writings here, right? And as far as the religion goes, you'd think that there'd be a natural, not just a power struggle for land and for power, but a theological struggle, perhaps, even going back that far.
Well, let me push you a little bit further on that. The archaeologists are shifting now. Over the last 2 or 3 decades, they've shifted pretty dramatically to the idea that the Northern Kingdom was far more advanced than the Southern Kingdom. Stories about Solomon and David aside, that the real center of civilization was in the north, and And here they come fleeing to the south. Now, Jerusalem has a nice wall around it, and it did turn out to protect them for over a century.
Yeah, the Assyrians took the northern kingdom. They couldn't take Jerusalem.
But by the time we have this little hint in the Book of Mormon, if Laban is the custodian of the Scribal school library, and that's where they have to go to get the brass plates, but he's carousing with the elders of Jerusalem. His buddies are the other guys.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of the competition you just suggested.
Yes.
I've gone a step further on this and suggested that this that the elders of the Manassite Scribal school could have become very concerned about their records losing significance, losing authority in the world that they can see right around them, what's going on in Jerusalem. And they determine the need to inscribe their written tradition on metal plates, which makes it a permanent witness. And that phrase, the permanent witness, is in the Old Testament. And that's why things are written on stone and on metal, is to make it permanent. It wasn't as effective as they had thought it would be. Later generations of people who get a hold of those materials say, I could melt these down and make a lot of money. Mm-hmm. So they're not as permanent as was hoped. But that gives us an explanation for why the brass plates were written in Lehi's lifetime. And it may also suggest why Lehi thought he had a right to ask Laban for them. Mm. He may have helped produce them. He may have financed them. But certainly as a member of the Scribal school, he may have just had a right to ask for them.
Well, and a major concern being in there that this is this going into the wrong hands and what's going to happen with this. And you bring that up and I start thinking about some of the things in the Old Testament, Solomon, the wise Solomon, is that a response to the northern kingdom, right? The whole legend of his wisdom, is it, if you don't have these schools, but they do up north, let's put Solomon up as the wise one. I don't know. It's just interesting to look at those things in retrospect.
These archaeologists who have found so much more advanced culture in excavations in the northern cities are exploring exactly the kind of question you just asked. And that there's a literature developing trying to reread everything through those northern eyes.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, it really changes your idea because, of course, to the victors goes the spoils, and in this regard, the 10 tribes are taken away, and you've got Judah left.
Right.
And so, who's keeping the record of the history? And it's there's not a lot of good things that they say about the North.
Well, and it goes back to your first point that these are two very different books. Mm-hmm. Book of Mormon and the Old Testament, that they are coming out of some traditions that are different in important ways.
Yeah, I agree. Well, Noel, really appreciate your time. This is fascinating stuff. I hope we can bring you back again as you continue to go down this road and gather some more information on this. Wonderful stuff. I hope that people could see, number one, there's a Josephite tradition and there's a Judahite tradition. The Old Testament is the Judahite tradition. The brass plates in the Book of Mormon are the Josephite tradition. I think we need to really separate that and understand that they are two witnesses. And they're two witnesses, not just because they're two books. There's two different lines. There's two different groups that are producing this for us. So anyway, from Cairo back to, are you in Orem, Utah County? Orem? Yep. Okay, back to Orem, Utah. Really appreciate it, Noel, and hopefully we'll get you on soon.
Thank you.
Bye. All right. Really appreciate that, Noel. It really is fascinating. I really love this stuff. it just brings up so many new questions and context and perspective on the scriptures. So
Well,
really fun.
for me, it's just so many things in the Book of Mormon all of a sudden fall into place. The Book of Mormon writers keep being kind of obsessed with this point and that point and another point. And all of a sudden, when you see this, you can see why those were important points for them.
Yes.
And